In response to the video I made about how God lies in Genesis 2 to Adam about the consequences of eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, people said lots of stuff. But a couple recurring things that people said is, number one, they would post Bible verses that say God does not lie or cannot lie or won't lie or something to that effect, as though that were proof that my interpretation of Genesis 2 was incorrect. Or they would post something like this comment right here, where the interpretation that God lies in Genesis 2 isn't very strong because the idea that God would lie would run contrary to the general idea of God put forth in the text. And I wanted to take a moment to respond to both of these responses, both these counter arguments to my interpretation of Genesis 2. First, in response to people posting verses about how God can't lie or won't lie or is always honest or something like that, yes, I fully acknowledge that such verses are in the Bible, half a dozen at least, that explicitly say that God can't lie or won't lie. I just don't think that that's actually a counterexample to the possibility of God lying elsewhere in the text. This is a thing that happens over and over again if you read the Bible and pay close attention to it. God is characterized, for example, as a God of peace on a number of occasions, but also a God of war. God is characterized as being a God of order and not of confusion, and then God will throw huge swaths of people into confusion. God will say on occasion that he has plans for you, good plans, and then he will have it out for large groups of people or particularly naughty individuals. There are a lot of contrasting characterizations of God all throughout the Bible, Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, and New Testament as well. And this is because, as I've said on 100 occasions before, the Bible is a multivocal text. It's written by very many different people in different times, in different places, and importantly, with very different theological needs. The characterization of God at any given time is primarily in service of the theological needs of the community, of the people that they are writing to and thinking about these ideas. There are lots of contradictions in the Bible, but these contrasting characterizations of God are probably the least surprising of those contradictions. So yes, some parts of the Bible will say that God does not lie, and other parts of the Bible will say that God lies. This is a basic fact of the text. As far as the second comment is concerned, like I have posted right here, I do think this is something interpreters of the Bible do need to pay attention to if you are trying to advance an interpretation of the passage that is just nowhere else found in Scripture, a truly novel interpretation that has no relation to anything else that's happening in the text. I think that would be a cause for concern. We're having an interpretation that's sort of special pleading, that's sort of ad hoc, that's sort of made up just for this one circumstance in order to have a hot take or something like that. So I do think a comment like this needs to be taken seriously and needs to be responded to seriously. And I think the best response that you could have to this is to simply point to other instances in the Bible where God is lying, or at the very least playing fast and loose with the truth. One example is in 1 Kings 22, where God sends a lying spirit to give false information to Ahab's prophets so that Ahab will go off to war and get himself killed in a battle. It's a very roundabout way to have King Ahab assassinated. Also a bit late in the game. It seems like God could have taken him out via thunderbolt much earlier. No fuss, no muss, but that's not what happens in this story. I can't really think of any way of reading this story that does not implicate God in lying. I suppose you could try and argue that God is not lying God's self, but rather sending a lying spirit to lie on God's behalf. But I don't think there's any morally intelligible way to distinguish between lying yourself and commanding somebody else to lie on your behalf. That's certainly not a distinction we'd be willing to make in virtually any other circumstance. And so it seems kind of special pleading in a very circular way on behalf of the person who's trying to advance this idea that God can't lie. But God lying, or deceiving more generally, is a pretty common trope in the prophetic literature. If you take a look at Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 10, and Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 9, all three of our classical major prophets, you'll see God lying to somebody, usually lying to the nation of Israel in a collective sort of way, so that they misunderstand the course of history that God is sovereign over, usually leading to their ruin. Now you might be asking yourself quite reasonably why these biblical authors are telling stories about God lying. And the answer to that question is actually pretty simple. I alluded to it earlier. Different theological priorities. We today place a much higher value on God being honest than ancient authors did. Ancient authors were willing to trade away some honesty on God's part, in these passages in particular, in order to preserve an idea of God's sovereignty. And that makes sense for an oppressed and marginalized people who are suffering horribly, often in the midst of these wars and imperial expansion of foreign empires. They want to know that God is still in charge. And one way to sort of do that is that, yeah, we thought everything was going to go okay, but actually God misled us so that we would come to this moment. But don't worry, God is still in charge of everything. There was a little bit of deception, but God is still sovereign over this entire scope of human history. That's probably not a trade that many people today reading the Bible would be willing to make, but a different person in a different time, in a different circumstance, might very well be willing to trade away some of God's honesty in order to preserve a solid idea of God's sovereignty in the most difficult of times. Whatever the case might be, there are several other instances of God lying or deceiving people, both in prose and in poetry. And so, no, I don't think my interpretation of Genesis 2 runs contrary to the general idea of God put forth in the biblical text.